I would like to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Ben Young, a graduate of Roosevelt's High School class of 1956, currently consultant of Hawaii State Hospital Quality Assurance and a medical consultant for the Social Security Administration. In 1986, he served as Vice President of Student Affairs for the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and in 1972 was Dean of Students at the University of Hawaii John A. Burns School of Medicine. He also received numerous awards from the medical and Hawaiian communities, including the OO Award from the Native Hawaiian Chamber of Commerce in 2011, Distinguished Historian from Pa'amo'olelo Award given by the Hawaiian Historical Society, and was in 2005 named Living Treasure of Hawaii by the Hongpa Hongwanji. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Dr. Ben Young.
Oh, thank you very much, Kalani.
You're
Appreciate your research into finding that information about ancient history. But how do I?
No, you're fine. You're good.
Okay, so slide one. Okay. All right, so I can go now. Right. So I was asked last year to give a talk about the history of the John A. Burns School of Medicine by Kalani. And I'm glad he gave me so many months in advance. I had a chance to reflect on a lot of memories about JABSOM. And let me go back to a film that I saw many, many years ago. It starred Gary Cooper, and the film was about Lou Gehrig. And of course, his name is eponymous with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The film was the pride of the Yankees. It starred Gary Cooper. And at the very end, Gary Cooper used those words by Lou Gehrig, and he said that I consider myself to be the luckiest person on the face of the earth. And in a very similar way, I consider myself to be the luckiest person to have been born and raised in Hawaii, because never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I would ever become a physician. Never when in middle school, high school, or even college. I eventually was fortunate enough to get through medical school, got to my residency here at the John A. Burns University of Hawaii School of Medicine. And when Kalani asked me to give this talk, I was thinking any medical school history would involve feasibility studies, fundraising, grants, buildings, and you would get the very generous contributions from foundations like Josiah Macy, Kellogg Foundation, all of which would amount to something that'd be a very boring talk. But the Wallace-McDermott report is very interesting, and I'll cover that later. And in the search to try to recall all the history of JABSOM, I remember the political battles, the conflicts of the legislature. There were so many politicians with hidden agendas. But anyway, you've heard that phrase, all roads lead to Rome. And though I might take somewhat of a circuitous path, I want you to realize that all my slides lead to JABSOM. Okay? So I'll take you a journey back to times long ago prior to JABSOM, and these are my reflections on the medical school. I was very fortunate that I did my first year residency at Leahi Hospital, and almost every day we would run into Dean Cutting. He stopped us, he stopped me and said, "Your name is Dr. Young, isn't it?" We were such a small place that he knew all the residents, he knew all the medical students. We would even have lunch with him at the Leahi cafeteria across the street. He was the first dean. Second dean was Terry Rogers. He served from 1972-78. He was initially the director of the precursor of the medical school, which was the Pacific Biomedical Research Center. It was he that was instrumental in moving the medical school to the biomed building. And another person who became the third dean was Chris Branson, who also served most of his tenure there at the biomed building. And then we have Ed Cadman, who came on board. He was responsible for the building of the campus here, there at Kaka'ako. I was really fortunate. I wrote up a grant to do some oral histories of some key Hawaiian people. And in that, I included the oral history of two of the deans. I was very lucky to get a oral video, and I interviewed Ed Cadman, but there were so many problems with getting this clipped and pasted onto the keynote that I just simply couldn't do it. I belong to the generation of the computer illiterates. So unfortunately, I just have these very brief snippets, but I'm going to make them available to Hawaii Medical Association if somehow you folks want to preserve and edit the videos. So here's the first one with Ed Cadman, and he talks about the beginnings of how he even heard of the name Kaka'ako. Oops.
Got a resolution in the 2000 session to put the medical school across from Queens Medical Center, tear down the Department of Health building. And I said, you know, wrong place, but the right idea. And Ben Cayetano called me up 6 months later, and I didn't know where this Kaka'ako place was. And he showed me out of the Gold Bond building, 10th floor conference room. And he pulled down to this spot, 10-acre spot. And I looked around, and there are dilapidated buildings everywhere. And so that's the spot that they took. And then the $150 million project was to be, the governor said it's not a tax-based issue. It's a tobacco issue. They have $40 million in the tobacco settlement on an annual basis. And
Okay, that just about tells us a little bit about his first impression of Kaka'ako. But I realized when I did this oral interview that Ed somehow was slowing down. His thoughts were not as quick as they used to be. He had a neurological condition, and I have his thoughts about it, and I'll try and cut and paste that later. But I remember asking him a question about success, and this was his response. Oops.
It's all about hard work, not laziness. It's all about critical thinking, not random thoughts. You set your heights and dream, and if you don't, you get a nightmare.
So you can see he had his humor too, but he was great. The next oral interview I did was of Terry Rogers. Let me give you a little bit of background. Terry was born and raised in England at Highgate. It's just to the north of London. And he was one of the most brilliant individuals I've ever known. He was proficient in Japanese, Spanish, French, German, and he was so knowledgeable about Shakespeare, Newton, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats. He was really a brilliant man. But I was able to, and he was also a classmate with the one who broke the 4-minute mile, Roger Bannister. Here's a little bit of information about him. As I got to know him quite well, he gave me photographs of his earlier years. He was a navigator on a dive bomber in World War II. And there he learned a lot about the G-forces on the human body. So he became interested in stress in the human body. He even put together a group that walked through the Arctic in minus 75-degree temperature and wrote up several papers about the stress of cold and stress on the human body. And here you can see him. He was part of President Jimmy Carter's team on trying to look at the solution for world hunger. To the right of Jimmy Carter is Rosalind Carter, and right to the top of his left shoulder of Jimmy Carter is Terry Rogers. They're in the Oval Room at that time. All right, so I did the interview. I did not do this interview. I gave this interview to Sandra Pratt, who was in the School of Journalism and needed some projects. So I had her interview Terry Rogers that
Going on. That's what's happening.
Did you get drafted into the army?
Heavens no,
Navy?
the Navy didn't take draftees.
You chose from high school to go to the Navy.
Yeah.
Why did you make that choice? You could have gone to school directly. What was the reason?
Well, you know, after Dunkirk, the enemy were at the gates. I mean, there was no sort of crazy flag waving or anything, but just everybody had to do something.
You thought it was your duty to.
See, I felt it was my duty, of course, yes.
Here was a guy who was a witness to Dunkirk. Here was a guy who even was there when Winston Churchill said those famous words, "Never in the history of world conflict have so many owed so much to so few," describing the people in the Royal Air Force at the Battle of Britain. So let me get to the topic of this presentation. Hawaii is our home. It's the most isolated, populated group of islands in the world, and yet it has some of the most fascinating stories anywhere. What grips your mind or grabs your attention when you think about something that's fascinating and interesting? There aren't too many topics. Money, power, sex, death. These are the most popular subjects in Barnes and Noble, and these are the best-selling books anywhere. So let me take you back to the early 1970s. I found myself in New Orleans, Louisiana. There was a break from the AAMC, the Association of American Colleges meeting. And so I decided to take a look at the French Quarter. I meandered through, and I went into this antique shop, usually full of junk, things here and there. There was a woman seated at the very top in the back of the store, and she looked at me. I didn't have a suit, so I had my aloha shirt. So she said, "Y'all from Hawaii?" I said, "Well, I'm from Hawaii." She said, "Would you happen to be interested in documents?" So I said, "Well, what do you have?" She said, "Let me go get it." So she ran in the back, brought up front this wonderful document with a medallion. And so let me just get a little bit closer. The document read, "Her Majesty Liliuokalani, Queen of the Hawaiian Islands, has granted a Medal of Honor to Mr. Frank Lavier in appreciation for services rendered to His late Majesty Kalakaua during a trip to San Francisco." And if you see the arrow there, there's a medallion that was also included in that. So I asked her, "Well, how much do you want for it?" She said, $250. $250 in the early 1970s was a lot of money. So I told her, "Well, let me think about it. I'll get back to you." So I came back to Hawaii, and I asked a friend of mine, Don Metcalf at Hawaii Ali'i Coin and Stamps, "Hey, I found this document. Do you know what it'd be worth?" I described to him the emblem of Kalakaua, and I described to him the coin, the emblem that went with it, the medallion, and finally he said that, oops. He said that, "Oh, sight unseen, I'll give you $1,000 for it." So I called the woman and I told her that, "Oh man, there are a lot of these documents and medallions in Hawaii. How much did you say you wanted for it?" She said, $250. I said, "Well, I'll give you 125. She said, "Okay." So I sent her the money and she sent me the medallion and the certificate. And I took it to another person who looked at it, and he used a microscope, not a microscope, but magnifying glass to check the signatures and the medallion. He said, "Did you know this is gold?" No, I didn't know. So he thought for a few seconds, said, "I'll give you $10,000 for it." $10,000. Well, a couple of years later, I went back to that same shop and there was a woman. And I said to her, do you remember me? She said, oh yeah, you're the one that bought that certificate and medallion. She said, do you still have it? I said, yeah, I still have it. She said, you better keep it. It's going to double in value one of these days. So I said to her, are you sure? She said, I'll guarantee it. So that was my first experience with something about the history of Hawaii. Not too long after that, I found myself in Savannah, Georgia. And I went into an antique store, asked the person if they had anything with from Hawaii. And he said, yeah, I got 2 stamps, I think. So he brought out these 2 stamps. One was the missionary stamp and the other stamp of King Kamehameha III. Said, how much you want for this? So sell it to you for $25. Said, oh, let me make a phone call first. So I went back to the hotel and called the same guy and he said, wow, if it's like you described, it's going to be worth between $20,000 and $25,000. So I went back to the store. I didn't bargain with the guy. I said, how much did you say you want for it? He said, $25. Okay. So I slapped down the money and I got the stamps. So I brought it home and took it to the guy. He looked at it very closely, even with that same magnifying glass. He said, Ben, he said, these are forgeries. I'll give you $3 for it. So let me just go from that to some medical documents in Hawaiian history. This is the first prescription ever written in Hawaii. It was written for Queen Kahumanu, who had an upper respiratory infection at the time. It was written by Dr. Davis. You can find it in the state archives. This is another document. It's a prescription signed by Kalakaua and written to this guy here by the name of A. McWayne. Who was A. McWayne? His name was Albert McWayne, who was a pharmacist in 1875. He owned a pharmacy at Fort and Merchant Streets. He then decided to return to school at Hahnemann in Philadelphia. He became a physician and he came back to Hawaii. But what about that document? If you look at the top right-hand corner there, it belongs to that guy. He might be willing to sell it to you for $250. If I were you, I'd offer him $125 and see maybe if you can get it for that. But if you get it for $125, I'll give you $1,000, sight unseen, no questions asked for it, okay? So be sure and you contact me if you get that for $125. So anyway, this is owned by Kalani Brady. Appreciate him letting me to show this. But with King Kalakaua, I thought it might be handy to just say a few minutes about the monarchs of Hawaii. There were 3 dynasties. That's fairly easy to remember. The Kamehameha dynasty, Kamehameha the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Their Hawaiian names are a little bit different, but if you just remember these names, Kamehameha the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, you should have no problems. The 2nd dynasty, think about the Lunalilo Freeway that you go on every day. Okay, so it's named after Charles Lunalilo, who reigned from 1873 to 1874. And then Kalakaua came on to the throne in 1874. There were 2 in his dynasties, King David Kalakaua and Queen Liliuokalani. That gives you a brief background of the monarchs, which are very important, which is a very important background when you look about the medical history of Hawaii. Let me give you an overview of what I'm talking. Here's the outline. Briefly about Governor Burns. Second, about the key precursor events in the 19th century Hawaii that eventually led to jabsdom. And these were the epidemics, 4 attempts at medical education, and the 3rd, the earliest hospitals, because you cannot have a medical school without training facilities, and those were the earliest hospitals. I'll talk briefly about the 3 jabsdom campuses, and I'll talk about jabsdom's 4 deans, and finally about the dean's portraits. So, Governor Burns. He was born in Montana, was a devoted Roman Catholic, and he graduated from St. Louis High School. He became a Honolulu policeman. He eventually worked for the FBI and was assigned the task of making sure he investigated the Japanese population in Hawaii, all the U.S. citizens. He submitted a report saying that the Japanese in Hawaii were no threat. With that, he endeared himself to the Asian population of Hawaii, and they backed him. And there was a revolution here in 1954, one of the most dramatic political upheavals in the history of this nation. Then he became a delegate to Congress, where he lobbied for the statehood of Hawaii. He became governor of Hawaii from 62 to 74, and these are three things he wanted at the University of Hawaii. Three important things. One, he wanted a law school. Second, he wanted a medical school. And third, he wanted a Division I football team. Well, two of the three became quite successful and quite famous. And I won't say which one of the three was the other one. So Jabsum at the University of Hawaii School of Medicine was named after him in 1974. What were the key precursor events in the 19th century that eventually led to the founding of the John A. Burns School of Medicine? Epidemics, 4 attempts at Western medical education, and Hawaii's earliest hospitals. Let me talk about those. First of all, showing you a graph of the decline of the Hawaiian population. Although this shows mainly the Hawaiian population's decline, please keep in mind that epidemics are no respect of persons, sex, color, nothing. Other populations were deeply affected by the diseases that impacted these islands. The first epidemic was that of venereal disease when Cook landed here, but the second epidemic is hardly ever mentioned by a lot of people. It's known as the Mai Oku'u in 1804. So this was Hawaii's first attempt at Western education. Let me give you a background of that. What was the Mai Oku'u? In 1795, Kamehameha had conquered all the islands, except for Kauai and Niihau. So 1796 was his first attempt at invasion, and a storm came up, and hundreds of his warriors were killed in that storm and drowned. So he retracted, he built up his forces again, and in 1894, he made another attempt to invade Kauai. But this time, there was an epidemic called the Mai Oku'u. Mai stands for illness. Oku'u stands for squatting. And there were thousands killed in this epidemic. Hundreds and hundreds of his warriors were also killed. This was the second epidemic in Hawaiian history, and this was a dysentery. If you look at the Hawaii Medical Journal back in May, June of 1970, is Bob Schmidt who wrote about this Oku'u, Hawaii's greatest epidemic. It's also written up in The Gifts of Civilization by Ozzie Bushnell. Ozzie was former chair of microbiology and tropical medicine at the University of Hawaii School of Medicine, which eventually became Jabsum. He was a classmate of John A. Burns, and he was I consider him the greatest medical historian Hawaii has ever had. He wrote in his book that the mortality was so high about the Mai Oku'u, the mortality was so high and the horror so profound that the memory of this massive assault upon the Hawaiian people persisted through several generations. This was Hawaii's first attempt at medical education, for as he faced the Mai Oku'u 1804, King Kamehameha gathered his best medical men at Nu'uanu, and he requested the ship's doctors to train them in treating the Mai Oku'u. The reasoning was quite sensible. Who would be better to treat this foreign disease than the foreign doctors on these ships that came from far off lands? But this attempt to train the kahunas was unsuccessful. Remember that this was at a period of time when Hawaii's medical practitioners were no better, nor any worse than Western physicians at the time. This was 50 years before Ignaz Semmelweis and the washing of hands, 55 years before Louis Pasteur and the germ theory, 60 years before Sir Joseph Lister and his introduction of antiseptic procedures in the surgical room. That was Hawaii's first attempt. The second attempt was in 1838. Again, let me take you back to that graph that I have, and I want to point out to you, 1838, the infant mortality rate was terrible. In fact, this missionary Artemis Bishop wrote in his journal, the great majority of children born in the islands die before they are 2 years of age. Just imagine what it must be like for parents of children who die. And hardly any child was present in Hawaii during this period from 1836 to 1838. 1838, this textbook was written by Jared P. Judd. And those of you who are familiar with the early years of medical school will recognize Charlie Judd, who was one of the most beloved members of our medical school. He was the great-great-grandson of G.P. Judd. And G.P. Judd wrote this textbook, was republished by it was all in Hawaiian, and it's republished by the Native Hawaiian Center of Excellence, and you can still find it in Barnes & Noble. This textbook was used to teach Hawaiian students the basics of anatomy at Lahaina Luna Seminary. So how is that relevant? Well, in order for these students to go out and proselytize, they had to know something about healing. And if you could heal the body, they could better attract converts and proselytize them to Christianity. So that's why this textbook was written in Hawaiian by G.P. Judd. The name again is Anatomia, and it's available at most the bookstores. And this was Hawaii's second attempt at medical education. Let's look at the third attempt, go down the slope to 1872. This was Hawaii's third attempt at medical education. What happened then? The Hawaiian legislature was so concerned about the depopulation of the Hawaiian population that they requested G.P. Judd to train at least 10 students in the basic rudiments of medical healing. And so he trains 10 students to go out as barefoot doctors, like the barefoot doctors in China. So after 10 months, however, G.P. Judd requested to be released from his responsibility. His beloved wife had died, and not too long afterwards, he passed away from a stroke. He used his textbook, Anatomia, to train the students in the basics of human anatomy. This is the document that he had written, but it's so hard to read. I wrote all the names down and look at them. They were sent to various parts of the Hawaiian Islands, so Molokai, Makawao, Mokohala, Kawaiha, Kona, Kau, Puna, Hanalei, and Waimea. Bushnell, Ozzie Bushnell wrote about this in his article in Hawaii's first medical school, and you can find it in the Hawaii Historical Review. And what about the fourth attempt at Western medical education? It occurred in 1880. There's an article in the Hawaiian Journal of History written by Agnes Quigg. King David Kalakaua was so deeply concerned that this was one of his attempts to try to stem the population decline of the Hawaiian people. So he decided that he was going to train leaders for the next generation of Hawaii. And he personally chose 18 students, and he sent them abroad to America, Japan, Italy, England, and China. And lo and behold, one of them was in medicine. So the question persisted in my mind, who was this first Hawaiian to study Western medicine? I was on the first voyage of Hokulea in 1976, and one of my crewmates was Gordon Pinaya. Gordon has passed away about a year ago, but we would also always have this get-together reunion of the crew on Hokulea. So we had this get-together, and Gordon asked me, "Hey, Ben, what are you doing now?" So I said, "Gordon, I'm trying to find who was the first Hawaiian to be a Western-trained physician." And Gordon said, "Oh, that was Matthew Makalua." I said, "Gordon, how in the heck did you ever know that?" So he said, "My great-great-grandfather was sent to England with Matthew Makalua in 1880. And so I know a little bit about him. And from Gordon, I was able to get some contact information, and I was able to track down Matthew Manuia Makalua, who attended Iolani School. He was cousin to Queen Kapiolani. He was the first to study Western medicine. He graduated from King's College in England. So one day I decided to go to King's College. I went to the student affairs office. I went in there and I met the people in that office and told them I was trying to track down this Hawaiian who studied here. And they brought in all his transcripts. They made honors in physiology and anatomy. And I looked around and they took me on a tour around the school. And there was a plaque honoring Sir Joseph Lister. And from their historical information, Makalua was a bandaged dresser in the surgical suite for Sir Joseph Lister. And they have a photograph of him, but the photograph is kind of blurred, so I'm not showing it here. Sir Joseph Lister was one of the great figures in the history of medicine. Also was able to track down his third, fourth, and fifth generation. You notice I have this arrow pointed to the sporran with a little packet. For someone who's very interested in Scottish history, it's the pocketbook that's worn by most people who are so addicted to their Scottish culture. So this is a picture of Matthew Makalua and his wife, Annie Clementina, whose maiden name was Dewar Makalua. But my search ended. Somehow, I couldn't get more information on this James Makalua. I went to the London archives, very little information. Then I found out from the family member he had changed his name from Makalua to Dewar. Dewar was his mother's maiden name. Why would he do that? Well, it turns out that there's a quirk in the Scottish inheritance laws. Annie Clementina, whose name was Dewar, had inherited a small fortune from the Dewar family. And the quirk in the Spanish inheritance law was that you had to have a Scottish surname in order for this inheritance to continue. So that's why James Makalua changed his name to Dewar. Who are the Dewars? They are the famous name for the Dewar whiskey, and he was a descendant from that. And in order for him to gain part of that inheritance, he had to change his name to Dewar. And he got that inheritance, and the family told me that he lost all the money because of women and alcohol. So here's a picture again of them. I met with the third, fourth, and fifth generation. David Dewar was his grandson. And so I asked him the question, where is Matthew Makalua buried? They did not know, but they knew he had practiced somewhere in Hastings, England. Hastings, okay? Those of you who are knowledgeable about British history will recall that in the year 1066, William the Conqueror left England. This was also called the Norman invasion. He sailed across the English Channel. He defeated Harold the Saxon at Hastings, England. By the way, Hastings is also the name of a former chair of the Department of Medicine. Remember Jim Hastings?
Yep.
He traced his family all the way to Hastings, England. So my wife and I decided to go to Hastings Cemetery, but I can never forget her comment. She said, "Are you crazy? There must be 6, 7 grave cemeteries in Hastings." I said, "I don't care. I'm going to try and find his grave." So we went to the town of Hastings, and there was a policeman at the railroad station. So I went up to him and asked him if somehow could you tell me about the which cemetery it would be best to visit for this Hawaiian who practiced here decades ago. He said, "Well, you might try the town center here." So went to the town center, asked the same question. They said, "Well, we can do research for you, but it'll cost you 80 pounds an hour. But do you know his name, his date of birth, date of death?" I said, "Yeah, I have that." So gave it to them. They did a little bit of search, and within 10, 15 seconds, they came back and said, "He's buried at Hastings Cemetery." So I said, "Well, how do I catch a taxi there?" And they said, "Well, why don't you call him?" So I called him, and the person on Hastings Cemetery said, "Oh, he's here." They searched and said, "But we know only approximately where he's located." Hastings Cemetery has over 50,000 graves there. So we went up there, and the cemetery director assigned one of the individuals to help us out. So we searched and searched, couldn't find it. Finally, we decided to break up. My wife went one way, Lee, the person from the cemetery office, went another way, and I went another way. So we searched and we searched. And finally, I found this grave with letters M.A. covered over this English moss. I bet it was him. And I cried out to my wife, I screamed at them, and I screamed at Lee, and they came running over. We cleaned the English moss, and there was his name, Matthew Manuia Makalua. So we found his grave. It had sunken about 18 inches into the ground. Well, as it turns out, I gave a lot of talks on Matthew Makalua, and one of the people that took up the challenges of this was the UH students at the Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge. And they decided to run trips to England. And on this occasion, they were welcomed by the mayor of Hastings, taken to the cemetery, and you can see them weaving leis here on the trip to Hastings. They located the grave with the assistance of the cemetery director and placed the flowers on the grave. So this is a photo courtesy of Nalani Belutsky. These are the 4 attempts. Following the Maiokuu of 1804, 4 attempts at medical education in the 19th century. Following the Maiokuu, the textbook that was written, Anatomia, Hawaii's first medical school in 1872, and King Kalakaua students abroad in 1880. These were the precursor events. I repeat them again: the epidemics, the 4 attempts at Western medical education, and Hawaii's earliest hospitals. You can't have medical education without the early hospitals, and there were so many. But I mentioned these in particular because the British hospital was for British sailors, and it was eventually torn down. It was right in the site of the parking lot next to Queen's Hospital today. There was Siemens Hospital, Plantation Hospital, but I'd like to focus on Queen's Hospital and Leahi Hospital. It's not to lessen the importance of places like Kapiolani, St. Francis, Kuakini, or Kauikeolani Children's Hospital. But Queen's Hospital had such an important part in the education of Hawaiian students. I'll get back to that slide, 1838. I'll go back 2 years, 1836 to 1838. Artemis Bishop wrote these words in his journal: "The great majority of children born in the islands die before they are 2 years of age." So 1836, a female child was born. That year, she survived. Her mother was Fanny Kekela Okalani Young. Her father was George Naea. She was adopted, Hanai at birth, by Thomas C.B. Rook, who was a British citizen, and her adopted mother was Grace Rook, who was sister to Fanny Kekela. She was descended from the younger brother of Kamehameha the Great, Keli'i Maikai. And age 20, in 1856, she was married to King Kamehameha IV. At the age of 23, she and her husband established the Queen's Hospital, and today is known as the Queen's Medical Center, the largest private hospital in Hawaii and a Trauma One facility. It's the first residency training site in Hawaii, and here's a brief history of internships and residencies. If you get back to the 19th century, Johns Hopkins was one of the standout medical schools in the country. A few years after the Johns Hopkins, I think it was about 1910, there appeared the Abraham Flexner Report, which was really a wonderful report that investigated all the medical schools in the country and recommended so many of them to close down. So many of the medical schools were run with chaotic curriculums, and they were proprietary schools where you paid the physician to become an apprentice, and then you were granted a medical degree. Johns Hopkins was noted for 3 things: the pre-medical requirements prior to entering medical school, that they required women to be admitted equally as men, and they had the first residency training in America, which eventually was picked up by other medical schools. 2 of the greatest figures in medical history in the world were William Halsted and William Osler. They were the ones who instituted the training residency program at the Hopkins Medical School. So in 1906, this was the first year for the internship at Queen's Hospital. From 1906 to 1975, there were a bunch of residencies. These were called freestanding residencies: psychiatry at Hawaii State Hospital, pediatrics at the Keokealani Hospital at Kuakini. Kuakini had their own residency program, St. Francis. These were all then integrated and became part of the University of Hawaii integrated residency program at JABSOM. But many forget that one of the main groups that Queen Emma addressed was the need for a hospital was because of women's health. So let's take a look at the earliest female physicians in Hawaii. Two of the earliest female physicians were Dr. Sarah Pierce Emerson. She graduated from the Hahnemann Medical School, and the second one was Frances Wetmore, who was a daughter of Dr. Wetmore, who came here, who was one of the last company missionaries, and he also had a pharmacy in Hilo. His daughter, Frances Wetmore, was his assistant in the pharmacy. She went back to medical school at the Women's College of Pennsylvania. Remember now, women were not very well looked upon to enter medical school in that time. And she graduated, came back to Hawaii, and served as a physician in Hilo. This woman came here. Her name was Tai Heung Kong Lee, married Dr. Lee, and from whom some very well-known OBGYNs, Galen Lee, who became descendants. She came here in 1893. She was left as an orphan, an infant, on the steps of an orphanage in Hong Kong. The nuns there found out she was so smart, so brilliant, they encouraged her to go on to medical school. She became a physician, came here just after the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893. Ripley, you might recall Ripley's Believe It or Not, had an article about her that in the 1950s, she delivered over 6,000 babies. So this is a birth certificate from one of the infants that she delivered. The address where that infant was delivered was at home. It was the address of 52 South Kukui Street. And if you look up there, you might be able to see his name. That infant was Benjamin Young. So she delivered me back in many, many decades ago. The first female intern at Queens was Marie Falls, who passed away in 1975. No other individual, male or female, in all of Hawaii's history has ever had a greater impact on healthcare in Hawaii, medical education in Hawaii than Queen Emma. Well, let me move on to Leahi Hospital, getting back to the slide I had of the bubonic plague in 1899. You can probably get a booklet about Leahi Hospital by calling there, but I got to meet Jim Moore several times, and he has written a book about plague and fire. One day he was in Chinatown, we were having lunch, and I was so stunned that here was a guy, only guy from the mainland, and he ordered chicken feet. He loved chicken feet. We're eating afterwards. He showed me the sign in Chinatown. On this site was the early Chinatown history. He said he became so intrigued with this sign, that's what motivated him to write this book about plague and fire. So if you're interested in the bubonic plague and fire of Chinatown, you should get his book. So here's a sequence of events. Bubonic plague, and afterwards there was a lot of enthusiasm for starting a hospital, and a hospital was started, but then the plague declined. But there were still incurable diseases. So they named that hospital after Victoria. But this was shortly after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. There were Americans who were living here, and they were so opposed to anything having any connotation at all with Britain, with England. So they decided to change the name of Victoria Hospital, which it was named at that time, to the Home for the Incurables, namely those with TB. The name then eventually was changed to Leahi, and this was a site for the University of Hawaii School of Medicine. These were the three sites: Leahi Hospital, the Biomed building at UH Manoa, and then Kaka'ako. So I used to know running to Windsor Cutting almost every day at Leahi Hospital as a first-year resident. And there was a report, but unfortunately did not quote Windsor Cutting accurately. This was a Wallace McDermott report. The report said that the University of Hawaii could not support a university medical center, and that was true. But that was not what Windsor Cutting advocated. He advocated that the first 2 years were to be there at the Leahi Hospital, but this was a period where you had Queens, St. Francis, and Capilani got caught up in the fervor of trying to increase the number of physicians throughout the nation. A lot of monies were available for capital improvements, and Queens, St. Francis, Capilani, and Children's Hospital were in a rush to also build facilities. So they were going to build the facilities across the street in keeping with Windsor Cutting's plan. So they were building the training sites to be held there at Queens, for Queens, St. Francis, Capilani, and Children's. But the Walsh-McDermott kind of ended that. And so they recommended that the training facilities for the 3rd and 4th years be at community hospitals. And that's how Windsor Cutting was so, had such a dream about the medical school, but at the end, he was really frustrated and disappointed that the Walsh-McDermott report misunderstood what he had planned in mind. That was Leahy Hospital. We moved to the Biomed building in 1972, and there the 2 deans that were part of this medical school were Terrence Rogers and the 3rd dean, Chris Branson. The school was built at cost of $7 million, and this was where the first 2 years of clinical sciences were held. Ed Cadman then became responsible for the building at Kakako. Let's take a look at the portraits of our deans. I know that I have taken you on a circuitous and tangential path. So this Penn State College of Medicine slide might seem to be way out of the path, but it's not, I assure you. Penn State College of Medicine is located right adjacent to the grounds of Gettysburg Battlefield. Well, I became interested in Hawaiians who fought in the Civil War, and I found out about this young man here, Henry Ho'olulu Pittman. He was a Hawaiian adolescent boy. He was the only prisoner of war. He was the only one to die in the American Civil War, to die as a prisoner of war. His grave is at Mount Auburn Cemetery, but I had the hardest time trying to find his grave because he was buried under his baptismal name of Henry Ho'olulu Pittman, not, okay? So anyway, these are some of the facts about him. After my talk was over, they took me on a tour around the medical school. And there at Penn State College of Medicine were these magnificent portraits of every dean that they've ever had, of every chair, of every department that they've ever had. So I was thinking, we ought to have this at the Jadson School of Medicine, but it costs a lot of money. So I sent out a letter solicitation to some of the early graduates, and my goodness, the money came in. And we were able to fortunately get Linus Chow as the first artist, and he painted all the portraits. The original, however, I had some problems with, and I contacted John Cutting, who's a physician. He's retired, living in Pupukea. And he said, you know, Ben, I think that they had a portrait of my dad at Stanford when he was dean there, but I don't know what happened to it. I think it's in the basement of Stanford Lane Library. That's the last he heard. So I called up the dean at Stanford Medical School and told him, you know, there was a portrait done of Dean Cutting. And if you folks are not using it, I heard it's in the basement of Lane Library. If you're not using it, would I have it? So he said he'll get back to me, and shortly, within 2 or 3 days, he called me up and he said, that portrait is not his to give away, but he said he'll photograph it and send it to me, and he did. And that's how I got the portrait for Linus Chow to paint that portrait of Dean Cutting. When I was a medical student, we also had a manual of clinical therapeutics. Little did I know that I would one day be under the feet of this guy by the name of Windsor Cutting. So this is a letter I found from the second dean, a letter to the class of 1975. He said, your class will always be a very special group to me because of my pride in your accomplishments and your patient helpfulness in our historic conversion to an MD's degree granting institution. You two have been the pioneers in the new program, just as much as the faculty. My feelings of affection lead me to take a special interest in the future careers of all of you. Each of you holds a future almost unimaginable to many of your parents. I wish each of you a sense of fulfillment that can come from the life of service that you now have the opportunity to lead. Chris Branson was the third dean. He was recruited to Jabson by Kekuni Blaisdell. He became the chair of medicine. He was the person who really became who really established problem-based learning here at Jabson. I remember one of the statements that Ed Cadman, who was the 14th dean, made. He said, our medical student population is the most diverse in the nation, and diversity is our strength. When you think about it, we're all immigrants. One of the best descriptions of this can be found in Michener's book, Hawaii, where he describes the Polynesians who came from the Sunset Lagoon, Caucasians who came from the farm of bitterness, the Chinese who came from the starving village, the Japanese who came from the inlet, the sun-swept lagoon. So anyway, one of the statements that can be attributed to Ed Cadman was that of greatness, not mediocrity, excellence, not average. If you walk by the John A. Burns School of Medicine, you see this sculpture. It was done by Ed Carpenter, and it's really appropriate because it's of kalo leaves, and kalo has a symbolism of life in Hawaiian culture. He also painted a portrait of Dean Jarris Hedges, so I'll leave that to the person who introduces Dean Hedges. The family came by one day and asked me to show them the portraits, and I did take them around, and lo and behold, who would walk into the lobby at that time but Jarris Hedges? So I took this photo of Jarris and Jane Chow. For you to know, there was Jarris Hedges that painted the portrait of John Burns also. I'll pull together this with something about Joseph Navahi. He was a contemporary of King Kalakaua. He was a legislator, historian, lawyer, and an artist. The name may not ring a bell to many of you, but some of you may have watched this show by Antiques Roadshow. Okay, so this woman walked into the antique store and found this painting, and she paid $100 for it. So she tried to get this on the Antiques Roadshow. She showed it, and the person said, "This is a value of between $250,000 and $350,000." My greatest horror is to dream that one day I will walk into an antique shop and the person will say, you know, there was a doctor from Hawaii that just came in, and I sold him that this document from your queen. I think his name was Kamehameha. It didn't have his signature, but had an X. And next to his X was somebody by the name of Vancouver. This is one of the rarest documents in Hawaiian history. And it's my horror that one day I will walk into an antique store and one of you will have found it and purchased it for maybe $250. So those with Nabahi, he made the stirring comment. There is but one alternative to saving our country, and that is to send our Hawaiian youth abroad to study. He also said that I paraphrase that, and I think this would be in the thoughts of every dean that our medical school has ever had. There's but one alternative to saving the lives and the health of the people of Hawaii, and that is to establish a medical school here. Did you know that Jabson ranks #1 in the nation for graduates and folks who are on the faculty? There's an olelo about this land of ours. Mai kahikina akala I kumukahi ake velona akala I lehua. From the sunrise at Kumukahi to the fading sunlight at Lehua. It talks about the breadth and depth of this land of ours. So who are the products that became the breadth and the depth of this land of ours? These are some of the graduates from Kauai to Hawaii Ka'u, family practitioners, Kehaukong, Kapua Maderas. Carla Nip Sakamoto is in dermatology. Kathy Pell is in child adolescent psychiatry. And Rick Akau is with Straub Physiatry. And from Waikiki to Waianae. Waikiki added Kalawava, who is Director of Medical Health, and Damon Tavares, who's a graduate of Waianae High School. Last week, I came across this article. This wonderful article, some of you were at that dinner about Dr. Jamie Tom and Shane Morita who are trying to increase the number of health providers on neighbor islands. Did you know that many also serve on our faculty? And these are Pat Blanchette, geriatrics, Nalene Andrade, psychiatry, Jabson graduate 1990, Richard Kasuya, Office of Medical Education, Jabson Office of Admissions, Ivy Nip, Family Practice, New Palafox. And if you don't recognize this guy here, that's the guy who's in medical education, former chair of surgery. Takanisha, right? Thank you very much. Then in the community, someone who rose to the ranks of becoming director of JAPSOM, the State Department of Health, Chiome Fukino, and the current director of the Hawaii State Hospital is Kenny Luke. So even those who serve on the faculty of JAPSOM. And these were some of the ancestors of JAPSOM who served on the faculty, so many of them. I composed a statement, and in Hawaiian culture, you're supposed to pronounce this, the saying, any saying, with only one breath. So I'll try. Wahala na kupuna akake, mohala ne na hua JAPSOM e kaunu. This is by Ben Young, translated, the ancestors have passed on, but the seeds planted by JAPSOM are now blooming. Thank you very much. These are my reflections.